Hi, class, back with the first lecture video of chapter 28. Here we're going to be discussing textures, timbre, and tuning. And first, let's describe. Probably the easiest one to describe is tuning, right? And you might ask yourself, why would we be discussing tuning? If you're involving a piano, well, that's tuning, right? It's tuned, right? Well, there's a lot of different kinds of tuning out there, right? The Indian ragas, right, do not use a 12 half-step octave, right? They are microtones, right? And there's video on Canvas of a piece of music that is for two pianos. One that is tuned, as we would typically find, well-tempered tuning, right? Your equal temperament, right? And the other one tuned a quarter step below, right? So tuning, easy to describe. Timbre, right? What is timbre? Timbre can be kind of described as the color, right, that an instrument makes, the colorscape that an instrument can make, right? For example, on a string instrument, if we draw the bow slowly and very high up on the fingerboard, we get a very mellow, soft, rich tone. Versus if we draw it very fast, close to the bridge, it's much more, I would say, dry sounding. Harsh, I don't want to say harsh, dry. Dry would be a good word. Much more sharp, poignant sound, right? So timbre, right? And texture. Well, texture can describe a lot of different things. Texture can describe stacked chords. Texture can describe vertical sonorities. Texture can describe instrumentation, right? Texture can describe register usage, right? So a lot of things. So that being said, let's get right into it. Explorations of texture, timbre, and tuning. I'm on page 533, right? The book goes on to just kind of briefly take about, we've seen increasingly important role played by texture in the evolution of post-tonal musical thought. One reason for this lies in the capability to provide a convincing means of musical organization free from the traditional conventions of key and chord. Okay. Even in the relatively conservative textural style of Debussy, we find an unusual preponderance of unaccompanied angular melodies, figuration independent of functional considerations, and vertical sonorities used solely for the sake of color. Let's break this down, right? Even the relative conservative textural style, right? Debussy is, when we're talking about things like this, rather conservative, right? We find an unusual preponderance of unaccompanied, right? Yeah, so just a single line melody floating along in the air. Angular, right? So I wouldn't say disjunct, but definitely leaps, right? Figuration independent of functional considerations, right? So non-traditional uses of traditional harmony, right? And vertical sonorities used solely for the sake of color. Yeah. Diminished sevenths, planing diminished sevenths, right? Quartal quintal harmonies, planing, right? Debussy loved that. As composers turn their attention to further explorations of texture, changes occurred not only in the performance demands placed on the player of traditional instruments, but also in the structure and size of ensembles, right? The massive orchestral forces in works like Stravinsky, right? The Rite of Spring, 1913, gave way to renewed interest in chamber groups, right? A lot of composers, even early as, Bartók, Bartók loved chamber performing forces, right? He loved chamber forces for performances. Soldier's Tale is a great example of that. Gosh, Soldier's Tale, do I even have the score? It's great. Yeah, Soldier's Tale. Excuse me, not Bartók, Stravinsky. What was I thinking? Though Bartók did love his, yeah. Clarinet in A, bassoon, trumpet in A, trombone, percussion, narrator, right, or lecturer, violin, and bass. right? That is the orchestration. Yeah. That is the orchestration of this score, right? Okay, so, yeah. So, that is, oh, it says in the book here, The Soldier's Tale, right? For clarinet, bassoon, cornet, trombone, percussion, violin, and bass also became a model of important procedure that many composers chose to follow. An example of theater music includes a narrator speaking roles for one or more characters, along specific directions for stage movements and dance. Cool, 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 cool. So what would you even label that under, right? So we're exploring not only the texture of music, but we're exploring the role of music, right? Traditional professional composers are exploring that, right? Other methods of exploiting the coloristic properties of traditional instruments proved attractive to composers. We have already noted Henry Cowell's experimentation with tone clusters on the piano, right? We've experienced tone clusters, right? In Aeolian harp. Cowell calls for the pianist to silently press the keys on the keyboard and then strum and pluck the strings in a manner inspired by the wind harp in which the title refers. So essentially, he's holding down a chord on the piano without allowing the hammers to strike the strings, throwing his hand across the piano so only those notes ring. I'm not going to do it on my piano. My piano's far too expensive. I'll do it on someone else's piano. I don't want to get any oils on my strings, right? So, Cowell again calls for the performer to play the instrument, right, in the Banshee 1925, right? Effects created by plucking the strings or drawing the fingernail across the length of the string, right? Attempt to invoke a legendary figure of Irish folklore for which the piece is named. Charles Ives, another good American composer, also made extensive use of tone clusters in his Sonata No. 2 for piano, titled Concord, Massachusetts. Great piano sonata, right? Very famous. Even calling for a 14 3/4-inch board to execute one of the tone clusters in the second movement, right? It's interesting performance to watch because the pianist picks up the board or it's sitting on the piano and he uses it to play, right? John Cage, very, very famous composer, is most notable for his compositional technique of prepared piano, right? Began writing works in the 1930s for prepared piano, which involved, right, another thing with texture. What kind of texture can we get out of this instrument? What kind of sounds can we get out of this instrument, right? People started exploring the piano as, what really makes the piano sound? Can we just make sound with the keys, or can we make sound with other parts of the piano? Indeed we can, right? So prepared piano is nothing more than placement of various objects inside the instrument, close or on, around, under, or attached to the piano string, so that when you strike a note, the object that is resting in or around or on that string affects the vibration of that string. There's a couple very good examples posted on Canvas related to prepared piano, right? Let me check my time here. Great. Good on time. Okay. So, in the 1970s, now we're jumping to the 70s, George Crumb continued the tradition of coloristic exploration of the piano using extended instrumental techniques. In two works written for pianist David Burge, Macrocosmos is compared to Bartók's Microcosmos, right? Bartók's Microcosmos. Any pianist should be familiar with this. Great, great literature, all the way from very, very beginning pianist age up to near advanced literature, right? Two works written for Macrocosmos. Volume 1, Volume 2 for amplified piano. Crumb attempts to achieve a synthesis, conventional keyboard, and unconventional inside the piano techniques, right? So, here on example 28-1, here is the Magic Circle of Infinity from Macrocosmos. So are we not only getting into textural uses of the piano, but now we're writing music to appear pleasing to the eye, right? That piece of music could very easily just be written out in traditional staff notation, but Crumb said he decided he wanted to do this in a circular notation, and it has an effect. Okay, Going on, macrocosmos calls for the performer to strum, pluck, precisely execute harmonics on strings inside the piano. If you don't know what a harmonic is, Google that. Right? As well as to chant, whistle, and whisper into the piano. So we're using all these different ways to get sound out of the piano, creating a texture, right? Almost at some point, we can consider this bleed over into timbre, right? Yeah. So one other key point that we need to point out here is in 20th century, the role of percussion instruments was greatly expanded. I mean, not only do we hear that with the Russian composers, even in, 1880s and on, but we get that with Aaron Copland, right? A more traditional composer, it's not traditional, more tonal composer. Greater, I mean, you listen to the... That's the Hoedown from Rodeo. That entire melody is not only played by the violins, but it's played by the xylophone as well. Kind of unheard of, right? That's kind of the Americana sound that we think of, and a lot of it is carried by percussion, right? A lot of snare drum, bass drum, xylophone, mallet work is done in that piece of music. And not only Aaron Copland, but other composers exploring other kinds of music were increasing the use of percussion instruments. So you can read about that in here. I'm not going to list every single. This chapter is really heavy in listing musical examples, and we're not going to have time to listen to every single one of them. What we need to be familiar with is the big key examples that we need to listen to, and the fact that percussion, the role of percussion instruments, grew during this time period. Yeah, so let's talk about tuning now. And the book goes on to kind of talk about tuning just intonation, right? Just intonation, I'm just going to briefly get into that, kind of discusses how harmonics interact with one another when they're perfectly tuned together. A true perfect fifth, a true major third. Sounds very different if you are listening than a major third on the piano or a major chord on the piano. A piano is equal tempered, right? Well tempered. So we get the Bach's well-tempered clavier, because before this, a lot of music, a lot of instruments, especially the keyboard instruments, played in just intonation. They played to pure thirds and perfect fifths and fourths, so that you could play perfectly in tune in the key of C major, but if you wanted to play in D flat major, there's no way it would sound in tune, because the intervals between the half steps were not. The intervals were based on mathematic, pure divisions. So an octave would be 2 to 1, a fifth would be exactly 3 to 2. In order to play in all 12 keys, we have to modify that tuning in order to be able to play properly, right? So there's a great video discussing tuning on Canvas that I'd like for you to watch, right? And the book goes on to discuss some pieces of music that even use tuning mechanisms that go so far as to go to the quarter tone. So a scale degree that is between C and C sharp, a quarter tone, or a quarter step, right? On example 28-2 is a very powerful piece of music, right? Excuse me, Penderecki. Written about the victims of Hiroshima. We all know what happened at Hiroshima, right? An atomic bomb was dropped on the sovereign nation of Japan, the city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, by the United States of America. And thousands upon thousands of people perished instantly. And this piece of music, not only is it somewhat graphic notation, but look at, it's also measured out by seconds, not by measure numbers, right? And you can see these black lines that go across and then kind of expand out. That is saying here that we have 1 to 12 violins playing that. And they choose a pitch between this and this to play. And then those violins can go out to that pitches and then back to those pitches. So they can go along and go maybe down, then back up, or they can stay the same, or go up a little and then go back down, right? It's a very, very interesting listen. It's a very difficult listen, especially when you pair it with what happened in history during this time, right? But I strongly suggest that you take a listen to that piece of music, at least part of it. It says this score is an example of graphic notation. We've already kind of discussed graphic notation, right? The score also an example of proportional notation, right? A notational style indicating approximate durations and spacing and intervals based on events and timings. In this example, given seconds on the timeline at the bottom of the score. So proportional notation, right? For 15 seconds, we're going to do this. I'm going to look at example 28-2 on 537. For 20 seconds, we're going to do this, and then 10 seconds. And this is, we can't get it exactly 20 seconds, but this is very close approximation. And the composer would essentially, or the conductor would essentially cue, be counting along, maybe have a stopwatch out, and cue, right? Okay, and we're going to go on, down on page 538 to paragraph 2. The idea of creating compositions out of sound masses, right? Masses of sound, distinguished not by pitch, but by timbre, rhythm and density and register and so on, can be traced back to Ives, Cal, and Varese. Another composer widely recognized for his sound mass compositions is Ligeti, right? Stairway to Heaven or Stairway to Hell, I can't remember which one it is. I think he wrote maybe two. He wrote both. Or The Devil's Staircase. The Devil's Staircase, I believe it's called. It uses a mathematical formula, almost like a square wave that ascends, right? Look it up, it's fascinating. That ascends, and it keeps going up and up and up, and you think he's going to run out of piano, but he never, ever runs out. But it's a whole, 3-minute composition. Sounds like it goes from here all the way up to here, but never gets to the top of the piano, but just continually keeps on rising. It's a fascinating piece of music, right? Very, very difficult, right? So, the complex cluster-like surface of his earlier orchestral works, such as atmospheres, are derived from micropolyphony, right? A term used to describe the canonic relationships between the voices, right? Interesting. Okay, it's interesting to note that Ligeti's music was brought to the attention of a much wider audience when a number of his works were prominently featured by Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Ligeti's works for keyboard, especially continuum, right, for harpsichord, and his 3 books of etudes for solo piano, 85 to 2001, are a compendium of contemporary innovations that continue to serve as a model for other composers. He's a brilliant composer, right? Then we can talk about new vocalisms, right? A term sometimes referred to the use of vocal technique based on talents of a particular performer, right? So a piece of music that we're writing for a performer. Also, even though it's not highlighted, we should know the term Sprechstimme, right? Which is German for speak song, right? It's a cross between singing and dramatic declamation, going back to Schoenberg. Schoenberg used this. We don't really need to talk about third stream. That's just the gradual introduction of jazz, blues, ragtime, and other folk, right, musical styles into the classical realm. So examples, Stravinsky's Ragtime, right, Milhaud's La Création du Monde, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, obviously a lot of Gershwin, Aaron Copland's Music for the Theater, right, Stravinsky's even composed a concerto for clarinet and jazz band titled Ebony Concerto, right? So, yeah. So a lot of music, Three Penny Operas, George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. We see kind of a crossover, Gilbert and Sullivan in the musical theater world. A lot of their music sounds very, very classical, but it's very Broadway at the same time. They bridge both of those worlds, right? So, that's kind of wraps up the texture, timbre, and texture, timbre, and tuning portion of this chapter. Next we're going to go on to indeterminacy, right? And we're going to get a whole new chapter of music. So stay tuned. I'll see you in the next video.